Hello everybody, welcome to today's webinar and thank you so much for joining us. Welcome back to those of you who have been with us earlier this week. Today is the third webinar in our mini-series about exploring the post-COVID landscape for climate action. This week's webinars have been made possible through the generous support of the European Climate Foundation, as well as the support of my colleagues here at Hope for the Future, who have helped to put this event together. My name is Helena, and I work for Hope for the Future as a lobbying assistant in our London office. So I work to support constituents and groups in the south of England and in Wales. For those of you who may not have come across us before, Hope for the Future is a climate change communication charity, and we exist to support individuals and groups across the UK to build relationships with politicians and to have more effective conversations with their elected representatives on climate action. Now, it goes without saying, and I think we're probably all a bit sick of hearing that these are unprecedented times that we're in and that they present us with unprecedented challenges. So this webinar series this week is really here to provide a forum for people to either begin or to continue to have climate conversations while the more direct forms of engagement are restricted due to social distancing and COVID-19. As such, we've given quite a broad topic for both for the whole week and also for today, in the hope that the discussion will really be directed by your questions from home and also by the interests of our wonderful panelists. So today we're focusing on the question of, if not COP, when? What can UK climate leadership look like in 2020? And so joining us to share their ideas in response to this, we have three fantastic panelists with us today. So we'll be hearing first from Paul Allen from Zero Carbon Britain, where he has been leading on the development of their research for 12 years. Paul will be sharing with us about their work on climate solutions and on communicating those to policymakers. We'll then be hearing from Hannah Martin, who is the co-founder and co-director of Green New Deal UK. And Hannah will be speaking to us about the work that they're doing and the kind of role of grassroots organising in UK climate leadership. And finally, we will hear from Lindsay Smith, who is joining us from the Energy and Climate Innovation Unit, where she is their head of engagement. And Lindsay will be sharing with us some reflections on engaging sectors that are beyond the usual reach of the environmental movement, in engaging them to be leaders on climate, particularly in the lead up to COP26. So in addition to our panelists, today I'm joined by my colleagues from Hope for the Future. Matt is our project researcher, and he will be monitoring your questions that you put to today's panelists for the Q&A section later on in the webinar. And George is also here, who is our media officer, and she will be monitoring the chat to respond to your comments and to resolve any technical difficulties that you may have. So before we get stuck in, just a brief bit of housekeeping from me. We're going to be recording this event, so you'll be able to view it on demand on our YouTube channel after the webinar. And we'll also be including links for this in an email at the end of the week. We're aiming to finish the webinar by about 3 o'clock. So we will have around 30 minutes to hear from our speakers first, and then around 20 minutes for some questions afterwards. And when you leave the webinar at the end, you're going to be directed to a feedback form where there's no pressure to fill out, but if you do have the time to take a minute to do that, it would be really helpful for us. And we really appreciate it. It really helps us improve our events in the future. Finally, if you do have any questions for our panelists today, please do ask them. You should be able to see a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And in that box, you can put any questions you have and that you'd like us to ask the panelists. And even if you don't have a question, it's good to keep an eye on the Q&A box, because you'll be able to upvote any questions that you'd particularly like to hear answered. There's also the chat function, which is there to help you communicate with other attendees, and also for any more general discussion and networking you might like to do, as well as to talk to George if you're having any technical issues. So that is all from me for now. So I'd like to hand over to our first speaker, Paul, who I think is going to share his screen with us.
Thank you. Is that loud and clear? Okay. I'm Paul Allen, electrical engineer, worked at the Centre for Alternative Technology for many years. And for the past 12 years, I've been leading on the modelling of zero carbon Britain. So what I want to do really is to help us recognise, first of all, as the COP's a whole year late, so we have to begin working on stuff now. But if you're going to solve a problem, you've got to understand the type of problem that it is. So climate change is a wicked problem. It's got feedbacks within climate systems that make it worse and worse and worse if you don't do anything. It's deeply ingrained in how we live, and there's no single solution. So what I want to outline here is some of the wicked solutions that can actually drive the rate of change that we need to see. The first wicked solution is from our zero carbon Britain work that we've been doing since 2007, is clear evidence-based. We have all the tools and technologies we need. Newest expert technologies are emerging all the time that can solve problems faster and quicker. So we can keep the lights on, we can keep the hospitals warm, we can move ourselves around, we can feed ourselves. In the zero carbon world, it's all there and ready and ready. The second wicked solution is the technology costs are actually falling faster than the experts predicted. The fall rates are actually amazing. If we look at the price of installed wind or the price of installed solar, it's dropped drastically and is continuing to drop, which is triggering increasing installations. And the more we install, the more research goes into production. The more research goes into production, the more efficiently and cheaply we manage to manufacture them. The cheaper they become, the more viable they are in more and more sites around the world. And so it's feeding back on itself, but it's a solution, not a problem, feeding back on itself. And the offshore wind costs, amazing. Offshore wind costs have fallen 32% from a year ago and 12% compared with the first half of 2019, according to Bloomberg. There's lots of analysts looking at it. Another very important wicked solution is new leadership is feeding back. New leadership is emerging. Over the past couple of years, it's emerged in all sorts of places. And it isn't the usual suspects. It's reaching out to retired doctors and vets, and all sorts of people are taking to the streets. And if we weren't in lockdown, people would be in the streets now. And it's led to sort of cross-fertilizing feedback, and it's a seismic shift, it's a cultural shift, and it's triggered the declarations from an increasing number of councils. So when we got our Machynlleth Town Council, the first in Wales to declare a climate emergency and begin working on an action plan, I sort of plotted the map of how many councils had declared. climateemergency.uk, they map them out, and you can see all the councils that have declared. And then every sort of month or two, I sort of screenshotted the map again just to see how it was emerging, and then more and faster and faster, and more and faster and faster. And it's feeding back. Councils are sharing sideways some of the stuff they learn. They're inspired by their neighbouring councils, to the point where it's a real obvious feedback is this commitment at new leadership level. But another interesting way that wicked solutions are growing is real life innovative projects on the ground that are shovel ready, ready to go, are being driven by innovative thinkers, been driven by communities, been driven by technology companies, been driven by council declarations. So we're beginning to see this shift in the sort of key areas that we need to change, like transport, the York Bike Bells or the Birmingham Big Bikes project, real life on the ground examples. Buildings like Energy Sprong that retrofit buildings and use the energy savings to cover the costs of doing it. Or Energy, Robin Hood Energy, a municipal owned Nottingham council, providing the cleanest energy possible at the best possible price for the citizens. But I think probably the most exciting wicked solution is number 5, is the concept of multi-solving. Once you've adopted a multi-solving mindset, you can actually maximize the benefits beyond the carbon reductions to reach net zero. So we can do it in a way that improves air quality. We can actually investigate the multi-solving, the intersection of health and climate. So we're solving climate in a way that actually works best for health. And of course, that brings in a whole new sector of people to involve and get behind. Similarly, in food, we can eat a healthier diet than we are now. We can make the UK far more resilient in food. We can build links with local growers, as well as getting to net zero. And in recent weeks, we've seen some really exciting shifts, bigger shifts than perhaps we imagined. So there's plenty of examples. Looking at cycle networks to aid cities' COVID recovery can actually teach us that we can get out on bikes. I mean, it's very hard to buy a bike now because so many people want to buy one. Or thinking about food, it's very hard to buy seeds or compost because so many people want to buy them. So we can begin to connect up things. And with this multi-solving mindset, we can actually recognize that we work together. By multi-solving, we bring in different sectors, and we see that those sectors with lots of shovel-ready projects are actually all focused on building a better world, a world that we're sort of proud of. So CAT set up a new Zero Carbon Hub and Innovation Lab to share zero carbon solutions, and we're inundated with responses for the Zero Carbon Live Zoom webinar trainings that we do. But CAT's also got huge amounts of master students that are looking at all these different topics, that are making their career out of it. They've committed themselves and they're excited about what they do. And I think it's that sense of collective purpose of doing things together that is probably the most wicked of all the wicked solutions. Thank you very much. I hope that was within 10 minutes. How did I do on time?
Perfect, Paul. Thank you very much. I have a question for you before we move on to hear from Hannah. You talked a little bit there about kind of co-benefits and multi-solving the problem of climate change. And so I'm really interested how you think we can kind of communicate that and move the framing of climate change action away from this focus on the things we're going to lose, and instead a more positive vision of kind of what we're going to gain from taking action. I know you've worked with a lot of different sectors through your career, so I'm really interested to hear how you think we can communicate that.
Well, when we're talking about big societal changes, people want to know what that would look like so they can imagine themselves in it. So building that vision is one of our unique contributions, that we use hourly data, 10 years worth of weather data, hour by hour by hour, to manage and explore as one possible scenario, demand and supply, how we run ourselves on 100% renewables with super efficient housing, thinking again about food differently, because we want to show that we can keep the lights on in the hospitals with 100% clean energy. We can still have warm homes, healthy food, and we have all the tools we need to achieve it. Clearly stating, we're not waiting desperately trying to invent some sort of eco widget. It's all there waiting for us. So by highlighting the real life shovel-ready projects in energy, transport, buildings, food, and land use, we can actually begin to then imagine them in our own town, in our own area. If we had that happening here, if we had this happening there. And so it becomes normal. We can begin to imagine ourselves inhabiting that world. And that's why we've been engaging with storytellers and theatre writers. We had a BBC afternoon theatre radio foreplay looking at a family going to net zero, and you heard it through all the different characters. But also by using language that highlights the gains, that we can phase in electric vehicles that can travel 3 times as far on 1 unit of energy, or we can install heat pumps that give you 3 times the units of heat for 1 unit of energy, and focus on the positives in the language as well. Does that help?
Thank you, that's so interesting. Thank you so much. I think we're going to move on to hear from Hannah Martin now. So Hannah, take it away.
Thanks so much, and thanks so much for having me. I I hope the sound of traffic isn't too loud where I am. I guess, so I was asked to speak to kind of thinking about who needs to be on board and what other kind of policies we need to implement in order for the UK to demonstrate climate leadership. A little bit about me. I'm a kind of climate organizer. Been organising for about 10 years. Most recently was mainly supporting the youth strikers all of 2019 in their mobilisation, which was really empowering and an amazing experience. And more recently have set up Green New Deal UK with my co-director Fatima Ibrahim to organise and support communities to campaign where they are for a Green New Deal. I suppose that first question for me, like who needs to be involved, which is the next slide that I've got. You know, I grew up in Wakefield, and I suppose it's an obvious message possibly for everyone in this room, but we are facing a crisis. I mean, near where I grew up in Doncaster, it was flooded this winter. People were forced to flee their homes. You know, the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees is millions more people, particularly in the global south, exposed to those kinds of climate realities. I suppose, you know, the other reality is that maybe lots of people have the opportunity to think about these questions and, you know, think about and contemplate the end of the world during a webinar or over a few weeks. But for many people, and particularly sort of starkly at this time, the focus is also on the end of the month. And for more still, it's about making it to the end of the day, because at the same time as the temperature is rising, the UK, we have an economy that is failing the majority of people. We're in the 5th richest country in the world, but after a decade of austerity, 14 million people live in poverty. That's 1 in 5 people, a majority of which are families. 10,000 people die each year because they can't afford to heat their homes. And life expectancy is stalling for the first time in a decade. So in answer to the first question, who do we need on board? I think we need everybody on board, and from the community level upwards. But we also need to recognise that when we're talking about the climate crisis, we are talking about a crisis of inequality as well, and addressing that in both the solutions we put forward, but in also how we organise with people and in which voices and kind of communities we try to uplift is going to be really important. So for us, what policies we need, that's the next slide, thank you. You know, for us, we feel like the Green New Deal is a kind of innovation in that sense. We feel like something that talks about inequality boldly and kind of in an upfront way is really what's needed. It's an ambitious 10-year national action plan to transform our economy and secure a livable climate and build that more just society that we so desperately need. You know, the history of this idea, it's had a long history. I've got a little timeline on the next slide. It was based on the New Deal, which was a series of programmes, public work projects, financial reforms and regulations enacted by Roosevelt in the 1930s in response to the Great Depression. What's interesting about that is people often forget that one of the key features of that initiative was about taking power away from that reckless banking system and back into control of government. There was always actually a very strong kind of financial reform element to that New Deal, which we think is also a part of where we should go with the Green New Deal. Fast forward to 2008, vast sums of money were created and thrown at the banks to restore the financial system. But actually people did start to ask, is there not a better way of doing this? And a group of kind of academics and policymakers got together and coined the phrase Green New Deal. Fast forward again, you've got the Sunrise Movement in the US picking up the idea of the Green New Deal. They then lobbied Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a young, passionate Latina congresswoman, to front the campaign, and she's been really critical in sort of propelling it into the public consciousness. Here in the UK, aspects of it were picked up by the Labour Party in their manifesto as part of the Green Industrial Revolution. But we're now in a strong Conservative majority, but one which is actually making concessions to elements of a kind of green industrial strategy. We saw trails in the Financial Times just this morning that Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, is going to announce a massive investment in green jobs as part of the recovery plan for the economic recession we're facing because of coronavirus. So actually, there's this kind of phrase which is used by Milton Friedman, who is obviously not someone I share any ideology with, but this idea that like the ideas that are lying around are often the things that get picked up in moments of crisis. And we need to make sure through our organising and mobilising that the Green New Deal, elements of it, is one of those ideas that's lying around that can be kind of picked up at this moment of kind of compression and crisis. Just to like move on, these are our kind of 5 principles. I won't go through them in massive detail, but this is where we've landed in terms of what the Green New Deal means to us. We need to transform our economy, we need green jobs, we need to restore vital habitats, we need to promote global justice. So those are kind of our like key principles. And I guess we as an organisation, if you move on to the next slide, you know, we feel like climate leadership has to come from the grassroots. And when I say the grassroots, I don't mean kind of isolated groups of organisers who aren't connected to their local communities. I mean like everybody. It means to come from kind of the public, and that public needs to be organised and to be pushing for kind of political change. So our kind of theory of change really is, if you pop to the next slide, is that we need to build a movement that's more powerful than a kind of the current ruling alliance, which is around, you know, profit-focused interests. And in doing so, we need to organise young people, workers, and communities, and those are the kind of groups that we particularly feel we need to organise over the next period of time and build power for. Our strategy, which is on the next slide for doing that, is that we feel like, you know, it will require massive amounts of political will and even greater kind of social awareness really to create those conditions. So we feel like we need people power and we need political power, and we're not kind of afraid of that. We're not afraid of saying that we are non-partisan, but we are like political in what we're doing, because actually political power is where a lot of this change will need to take place. The level of investment that's needed, the level of kind of re-regulating different sectors of the economy that's needed. So our plan for that, just quickly, is that we want to develop local organising hubs. We feel like people speaking out on the kind of localised solutions that they can see and feel and that they know they need is like a really powerful tool to tell the story of the vision we want to see, which is some of what Paul spoke about as well. You know, people know what they need. They know they need better public transport. They know they need clean and warm homes. They know that they need good jobs that are secure and well paid. And actually organising people locally is a really good way of kind of building pressure on Parliament and using storytelling at the local level. So yeah, next slide. We're aiming to have hubs all over the UK. If people are interested in either getting involved, we've got about 30 hubs already set up, but always looking for more people to build leadership in the local community level. And then, you know, the next slide, we're kind of aiming to build that movement, translate it into political pressure, and also embody the change we want to see. You know, under the Green New Deal, we feel like this would be a more just way of organising society. We feel like it would unlock people's democratic potential and engagement with the issues that they really care about. And we hold those values quite close to the way we organise, the way we do it. I don't know how much longer I've got left, actually, a couple of minutes maybe. These are just some of the steps I thought you might find interesting and kind of how we think about setting up a hub. It's a sort of process we take local leaders through if they want to come on board and start organising with us. And then I just wanted to introduce you guys finally to the Build Back Better campaign, which we've just launched in the last couple of weeks. This was in response to the coronavirus crisis. We felt like profiling the Green New Deal as part of a number of solutions we need to build back better from the recession we're about to face is a kind of way of collaborating with many, many more groups. So we've kind of convened about 70 organisations and groups underneath this campaign, and are aiming to mobilise people and organise people to build sort of a public voice around the recovery plan. So we know lots of organisations and policy groups and think tanks and all that are kind of doing work of mapping out what a green recovery or what a good justice-based recovery looks like post the kind of recession we're facing. But we also feel like having a kind of public voice, a public mobilisation around that is really, really important, and organising people is the way to do it. So yeah, we're aiming to do that. Some of the details are kind of in the next couple of slides. So we're going to organise our communities, and then the next one we're going to mobilise all together around some key moments which are coming up, and we're going to try and win political support through political advocacy and tactics like that. So that's kind of what we've got going on at the moment. I would love to kind of hear questions on it and talk more broadly about how organising can play a key role in the run up to COP. I think that, you know, COP is only going to be as successful as the story we tell around it and the vision we paint and the people that we've got on the ground who can kind of bring that to life and put pressure on governments to, you know, do better and do more and show leadership. So that's why we're focused on that as a particular tactic. We recognise a part of a movement ecology where like everybody has a role to play and different organisations have different roles to play. And yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Hannah. That was such an interesting insight into the work you're doing at Green New Deal. A quick question for you before we move on to Lindsay. You mentioned it about how you are a kind of non-partisan organisation, but also I think that the term Green New Deal has you said as well, is heavily politicised and has been kind of associated with Labour and with kind of the Democrats in the US. How are you kind of making these messages appealing to people across the political spectrum? Like, is there the message? What is the messaging that you use in order to kind of to show that this is a cross-party issue and something that we can all work together on, whatever our politics?
I think that, well, I think for one thing, we tend to, within the kind of sector I'm in, like make assumptions about what people who vote in different ways actually want from their policies. And actually a lot of polling recently suggests that people, particularly in the light of what's just happened, where people are seeing the kind of cracks in the way in which we run things in a very real way. Actually, a lot of polling suggests, we did some polling recently, like 75% of people across the political spectrum want a jobs guarantee. Like that's traditionally a very like lefty policy. Similarly, around 73% wanted rent controls. Again, a very lefty policy in some ways. But actually, when you look at like the policy level of what people want, it is often more kind of seemingly radical than like we kind of give people credit for in a way. And I think that for me, it's about communicating the vision and the policies and the storytelling around that to people and helping them see that they have a place in that vision. Like most people do want clean air, warm homes, good public transport. And most people, when you explain like how the economy works, would be prepared to invest in that and want our government to be a kind of investment-based government. And I think that that has come quite more sharply into focus over the last couple of months with this crisis. And I think the types of work that we value, how we value the people who are doing it, and the way in which we see like our economy has kind of come to life for people. So I think I suppose I would push back slightly and say that I think that the traditional lines that we've drawn around different communities and how they vote is maybe not as kind of binary as we might think it is. And I think that we can appeal to people who maybe wouldn't think of themselves as left by talking to them about things that they know matter. And in mobilising those people, you know, governments do listen to their constituents. We are still in that phase of our democracy. And I think that by mobilising those people around those kind of common sense policies, really, I think government will listen to them. I think, you know, the Conservative government does have a massive majority, but it is also still trying to secure that majority, particularly in, you know, seats that it recently won. And I think those are particularly places that could really benefit from a low carbon investment based recovery. And so mobilizing those people around that, I think, has the kind of political edge that we need it to have. So yeah, maybe that's the beginnings of an answer to your very good question.
Thank you, that's so interesting. Going to pass on to Lindsay now.
Thank you. I think we'll probably have a perfect segue on from Hannah, talking about the Build Back Better stuff, because I think all of that links very nicely into the new context within which COP will sit come 2021. I should probably start by saying I've been at the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit for all of 3 weeks now, so we'll do my best to speak to the work that we're forming, but it's all very new in train around the kind of water society piece on COP26. So the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit, what we do is we aim to ensure that kind of debate around climate change happening in the UK is backed by evidence and is kind of evidence-led. And similarly, where there's voices that have kind of evidence or stories to tell, they've got a platform to do that. So we are starting to have a look at kind of how recovery links into COP26 kind of evidence-wise, and with a lot of the kind of success of COP and the way the government are seen at COP26 kind of pivoting on how we recover from this COVID situation, and whether we kind of build back better and invest in clean and green jobs and industry, or whether we go back to business as usual, as I think a couple of people have hinted in the Q&A. So some of the work that we've been doing around that is focused on the voices that have perspectives on recovery, that can speak to specific sectors like transport or levelling up through energy efficiency and things like that, and putting them in touch with journalists through press panels and things like that to make sure that the diversity of voices on these topics are being heard, because I think climate can be quite a tricky bubble to try and break into if you're a new person coming into that conversation. There's a lot of kind of people that know each other and speak to one another, and it can be quite tricky to know where your sort of entry point is into that conversation. So on the COP work specifically, it's worth kind of prefacing all of that by saying that there has kind of been concerns around how the COVID pandemic might impact kind of ambition from the government around climate change. But a lot of polling has showed that 71% of the public feel that climate change should be tackled in the same vein as COVID-19. So it shows that there's still a real kind of thumping ambition to get our emissions in order and start hitting our carbon budgets. And the CCC, the Committee on Climate Change, who sort of guide the government on all of their climate sort of policies, aim to have their next report coming out at the end of June, which will be looking at how we can recover cleaner to get us on track to those carbon budgets in the run up to COP26. And it's also worth saying that a lot of the kind of background aspects of COP26 that play a really important work in the and a really important role in what COP actually looks like, such as nationally determined contributions and the Paris Agreement, they all still exist. So nations need to be putting their nationally determined contributions for how they're going to actually meet 1.5 degrees on the table this year. And that doesn't go away with the COVID pandemic. And a lot of the kind of UN process meetings between governments are still ongoing virtually to try and leverage where they can better ambition from different countries and make sure we're in a strong position globally in the run up to COP. So just a bit of background on that sort of stuff that's still ongoing to show that climate is still very much a kind of popular topic. On the kind of work that we're doing around COP, or starting to plan doing, we sort of spotted when the date was announced for COP26 in the UK, that there were a lot of sectors that were looking for entryways into the debate and trying to find out more information about how COP26 works, what it actually looks like, what it means for them, how it being in Glasgow might interact with other things going on in the country or internationally around climate. So we've kicked off a piece of work sort of bringing together voices from theatre, museums, music, financial institutes, business, emergency services, and just trying to find out what the information barriers and evidence barriers are that they might face, that mean that they don't know how to kind of use their stories to engage in the conversation over the next 18 months. So we've got a Road to Glasgow newsletter, which you can sign up for on our website, which is a little plug there. But that kind of aims every month in the run up to COP26, potentially more regularly as we get closer to the event, to give people updates on the kind of conversations that are happening between governments. It gives a platform for some of these kind of underrepresented sectors and voices to speak to their plans on how they're going to achieve net zero, how they're decarbonising, what they would like to see from COP. So we've got a kind of blog platform that will be featured in there, and also aims to link people up to different events and other people doing similar sort of work to kind of information share around those sorts of things. And that's a really broad list from kind of parliamentarians to business leaders to kind of general public. So it's a good kind of resource space for that. We're also planning a series of webinars which kicked off on Friday, which looked at the new pathway to COP26. And that aimed to sort of explore what the science might look like and the policy pathways now that we've had this pandemic, or we're in the midst of this pandemic, how that might have impacted our progress towards net zero in the UK and globally over the next 18 months. And also how COPs work and all the things that I mentioned before. So the kind of inner circle and how that links to all society and the public, and how people can kind of engage in those different levels of COP. And then we use that as a platform to give the different speakers another opportunity from sport and museums and all the rest of it to just talk to their kind of plans and how they might engage, to information share, how that might inspire other people to do similar things. So our kind of webinar series might focus on the different pillars of COP and how they work. So what does the pillar from COP on nature-based solutions actually mean, and how does that resonate with a theatre in the UK or a school in the UK? And likewise with transport and other aspects and finance and things like that, that will be kind of hot topics over the next 18 months and at the COP itself. So just to kind of cover off the sorts of people that we've been speaking to give you a flavour of the kind of things going on out there, which fits nicely with what Hannah's been talking about, you know, their role is sort of mobilising lots of these people. There's other initiatives such as the Race to Zero, which is being launched by the COP's Champions team, I think this week, which aims to basically galvanise net zero commitments from businesses, local authorities, and the likes of it. And our role in that is just to kind of gather the information and around the number of people that have made these commitments, and then we represent that as a percentage of GDP, just to show what portion of the globe basically are actually committed to net zero, and looking at what those pathways might look like. So there's initiatives like that. There's also the Tedx Countdown, which aims to bring together sort of people at local level, businesses or theatres and the NHS trusts and things like that, together to actually look at what those pathways to decarbonisation might actually look like. So lots of initiatives looking at actual action and forward momentum in lots of those spaces. So some of the people we've worked with are people like Claire Poole, who's the CEO of something called Sport Positive, who bring together sports brands and elite kind of sports grounds and things like that around how they might actually decarbonise, and then trying to find a way to the evidence they bring from the sports community. How do we kind of bring that into the conversation that parliamentarians and global governments are having? Similarly, been speaking to a guy called Gurjit Singh, who's doing a similar role for TEDx in Glasgow and doing amazing work, basically trying to run sort of citizens' assemblies, but for all society stakeholders in Glasgow in the run up to COP, to look at how that kind of the city of Glasgow and all up in Scotland can kind of be a shining beacon of example by the time that COP comes around. And we also, on the more kind of global stage, had a speaker from Future World Tours, who are a music production company that are linked up with Will Smith's production company. And they sort of bring big hitter names like Miley Cyrus and Justin Bieber to do sort of climate relief concerts aimed all around net zero. And they're looking at how they use big kind of music names at COP26 itself to take what's happening on the day at COP and turn it into something publicly palatable. And so similar to what ECIU try and do is just break down some of that information into kind of understandable chunks for different audiences. So that's some kind of information around the types of people that we're speaking to, very much looking at the format that might take and how we start to bring some of those people together to share insights with them around polling and message testing and all the rest of it. just to give them the tools basically to, yeah, engage in that conversation as much as they like. So it's a long journey, lots of time to get planning, lots more than we had before, which is potentially a godsend for lots of people, I think, but as long as the ambition doesn't disappear.
Fantastic, thank you so much, Lindsay. A quick question for you before we move on to our Q&A. I'm interested in how you've been talking a lot about kind of the work that I guess you as ECRU are doing in engaging all these sectors, but how would you encourage, I know a lot of our participants might, and attendees today might work in climate NGOs already, but they also many do not. How would you encourage kind of us as members of the public, as citizens, to be engaging with these other sectors that you are working with, to encourage them to lead on climate in the lead up to COP?
Yeah, good question. And I think if I sort of take my ECRU hat off and speak to kind of experience from the Climate Coalition and working with the air quality movement and things like that, I think the same as with anything, and kind of putting pressure on governments or whatnot, businesses have, and other places like theatres and all the rest of it, the conversation is unavoidable around climate change now. It's not a sort of niche secret conversation. And I think actually people do want to hear from people about what they expect from a service or from an organisation, and they're starting to kind of look at their practices and how they improve that. So from a kind of theatre perspective, a friend of mine's dad runs a theatre in London, and is very much because of what he's heard from people who attend the theatre about what's their sustainability policy, or how do they kind of, are they using renewable energy and things like that. So having those questions asked at kind of point of sale and in sort of response to newsletters and things, I think definitely has an impact. It's just then, I think the next chain along is being informed enough to know where to go next. And how to translate that into actually decarbonising your own business, or your own home, even from a personal level, because they're quite tough questions, and there's a lot of kind of places out there that offer that sort of support to businesses and people. It's just being able to connect those people together. But I think just always asking the questions, and don't assume that somebody else is doing that. It's easy to kind of assume, and then we never get anywhere. But yeah.
Fantastic, thank you so much. Thank you so much to all three of you for your brilliant presentations. I'm now going to pass on to Matt, who is going to mediate our Q&A part of the webinar.
Thanks, Elena. Yeah, thank you all for submitting your questions. We've had absolutely loads of them coming in. And thanks, Paul, because you've already been answering a few of them in the text box, so we've already made some progress on that. We'll start with one to you, Paul, from Logan, which is that you focused in your presentation on largely technical solutions. To what extent do you think politicians praising technology as a solution gives them cover to avoid making the difficult decisions that need to be made?
Well, I think we try to kick the ball forward by showing the barriers aren't technology. The barriers are actually policy, the barrier is culture. So just by getting the technology question out the way, we don't focus on it. We just say, that's all ready. What we need is the policy to deliver it, to scale up the shovel-ready stuff that's emerged all over the country. So I think it's a way of removing a barrier to get onto the big conversations about policy. Rather than, we say, oh, we're not ready with renewables, so we have to do more gas for a while, or something like that. I said, no, it's all ready to go.
Do you have any concerns of the kind of climate technology optimists who say we don't need to take any action now because we can rely on some kind of magic bullet into the future? Is that a risk politically that we should be aware of? Absolutely,
we should be totally aware of that. In the work that we do, we have two fundamental processes: powering down the amount of energy we use to deliver society's goals by like 60%, because we're using way, way, way more energy than we need for mobility, food, warm houses, light bulbs coming on. We're chucking away huge amounts of energy. So we're powering down the amounts to give us an attainable target with clean technologies. So we don't have to depend upon people who are in infant school now paying for and building huge amounts of carbon capture and storage devices to make up for our lack of activity now. And Kevin Anderson's site is very good. He's a leading climate scientist who makes it very, very clear about the dangers of depending upon future deployable technologies to counteract the fact that we don't do what's necessary now.
In terms of the projects that are ready now, we've had a question from Rory, who just wondering if you could expand on what you consider as a shovel-ready project. There's many renewable energy projects which have received the relevant permissions, but which have not been built out due to the removal of subsidies and have struggled to become financially viable. Do you see a role in the future for such projects?
I think by what we mean by shovel-ready is actually the absolute antithesis of all of this supposed carbon capture and storage stuff that will be invented and will be paid for and will be deployed at massive scale in the future. What we're talking about is things that are actually on the ground now in Nottingham, in Leicester, in Machynlleth or wherever, that are proven to work. We can do the numbers, we can see the capital investment, the operating costs, the returns, the benefits, the jobs. And because they're real and we can measure them, we can scale them up. We know that they work. So that's what we sort of mean by shovel ready. It's all ready to go and proven. It just needs the policies to scale it up. Now, one of the problems with policy is the economics, and a lot of the actual costs of burning fossil fuels aren't paid for by the producer or the consumer. They're externalized. So the costs of future adaptation to fossil fuels burned on Thursday, the 12th of September 2020 aren't paid by producer or consumer. They're just pushed on to future generations. So we need to make sure that all our choices pay the full levelized cost.
Thank you very much for that. And very, very quickly, pause one more. I can see you've already touched on it in the Q&A box, but Mark was asking about solar panels, which I suppose brings us on to things that we can do individually. Which are there any things that you think are almost shovel ready for individuals that we could all be doing right now to lower our carbon emissions, particularly of our homes?
Absolutely, there's lots and lots of things, but they sort of fall into powering down by looking at how energy efficient is your home and what are the available local contractors, approved installers that can retrofit your home, thinking about your journeys and how you move about, public transport or cycling, walking, rather than individuals in fossil fueled cars. So that there are lots in all the key sectors of energy, buildings, transport, food and diets, balancing. If we look at what's a healthy diet for a human being, it's quite different to the average diet today. It doesn't mean everybody has to be vegetarian or vegan. But if we move to the right mix of foods, we can reduce our climate impacts, but we can also reduce the enormous amounts of food we're importing from other parts of the world, which makes us actually a much more resilient UK. So by thinking not just what type of food you get, but where you're getting it from and supporting local supply chains so that we know our farmers connect culturally with us. And in Machynlleth, there's sort of sprung up land army of people at the moment who are going out and working in agricultural sector because they really, really enjoy it and they're culturally connecting with it. So there's huge amounts you can do, but I think it's worth thinking of it in terms of powering down the amount of energy so you're getting what you're looking for, but in the most energy efficient way, and then looking for local supplies of food, local supplies of energy, and so forth.
That's great. Thanks a lot, Paul. Moving on to a question for Hannah. It's coming from Karina, who asks, do you think there's a danger that without a strong public consensus about what terms like green recovery, Green New Deal and building back better mean in practice, that they could be used to greenwash minor changes or even business as usual? And I suppose this probably does touch on what you were raising about Rishi Sunak and his talk of a green industrial revolution. Should we be wary of people using those terms and whether they've got a properly defined meaning?
Yes. Also, though, I think contested terms is always a thing in campaigning. Like that's, there's always kind of tussles over like what something means, and like that's part of the campaign, is to kind of win the narrative argument around what you mean by what you say. And actually when when we picked the phrase Build Back Better, we kind of did it in the knowledge that like it might be something government would use. You know, we could say because of our campaign, but really, I mean, they would have used it anyway. So it's kind of, you know, we kind of knew that, and we were kind of playing with the idea of like, is it useful for them to be using it? And then you can kind of hold their feet to the fire and be like, well, for us, building back better means good jobs. It means regional distribution of jobs. It means protecting nature. And what you're saying is not this. I think that we felt like by using a frame like the Green New Deal, we would still be able to preserve a kind of thing that we could point at and be like, what you're doing isn't this, so it's not enough, you know, and actually it would be unlikely that they would use that frame. I think that we do need to, it's tricky when you're kind of trying to build a movement around a thing, because actually it's always going to be contested, not just kind of at the national narrative level, but within local communities. Some people are going to set out their stall for what it means, and that not necessarily be the same as what someone else is meaning. So I think that's why we've kind of operated at the level of principles, where you say, these are the sort of red lines for us, these are the things that, these are the tests we would want a Green New Deal or a Build Back Better thing to kind of meet. And from then, people, organisations or groups can kind of craft policies that sit underneath it. So, you know, our role, I feel like our role is to kind of create the public consensus and the conditions at a sort of narrative level. This thing has to put people first. It has to, people shouldn't pay for it. You know, we shouldn't be bailing out unconditionally high carbon industries without just transition plans and emissions targets in place. You know, these kinds of bigger principles around which a recovery should exist. And that creates space politically for the government to then sort of have conversations with people who are like doing the policy. And that's where I see our role in the movement. But it is always a risk. And if you look at, you know, what's happened with the kind of living wage as a concept, that's kind of an interesting thing where like what is called a living wage is not actually a living wage. So that is the risk that we face, I think, and we're kind of alive to that, I guess, is where I'd land.
How optimistic are you about how the next few months are going to play out? Where do you think we'll be at the end of the year, having seen how the government responds to this crisis with the bailouts, with this potential green stimulus? What's your insight into where things might be heading?
How optimistic am I? Oh, I'm rarely optimistic, but that doesn't mean I don't keep going. I don't think it's always very useful to kind of, people often, and actually I don't mean this as some sort of like slight on the name Hope for the Future, but people often are like, what gives you hope? And I'm like, not hope. I don't have much. I mean, I have courage and sort of a dogged determination to keep going. And I think that people every day around me and like, you know, my community or the organising that I do give me that like courage to keep going. So I think I would say I think that there is an opening through this crisis to begin to have those bigger picture conversations about what's not working in our society in a way that is pretty unprecedented. And that opening needs to be seized by campaigners across the political spectrum, because I actually think that there's a lot of consensus around what's not working. And I think there's a lot of consensus around the level of inequality that exists. And I think there's a lot of consensus around climate change. So like, if there's that consensus, then that is what we need to be pushing on at loads of different levels, in loads of different ways, with loads of different tactics. You know, and I think there is potential for the government to, you know, they've already operated in a way you would never have expected this version of a Conservative government to operate. I mean, they're literally paying for 80% of people's wages. Like, who would have thought that would have happened a couple of months ago? So I think the sort of span of what is possible is shifting so quickly, quite difficult as campaigners to kind of keep up with it in a way. But I think we need to be raising our ambition and what we're calling for to the level of which the crisis has sort of opened up. And that's what I would kind of be focusing on, I guess.
Thank you very much. Lindsay, can we just bring you in on this? Just in terms of what Hannah's saying there, how do we kind of have this balance between hope and despair in our messaging in the climate movement. Ed Miliband was talking the other day about the importance, we can't just be all gloom and doom, you know, talking about flooding or constant droughts, but then we have to have a positive message. But then how do you find the balance between those two?
Isn't this the question that we, I don't think we've ever quite nailed it, have we? So my kind of background is WWF and the Climate Coalition. So I very much come from a space of talking about polar bears and ice caps to talking about sports fields flooding in the UK and the sort of small changes you can make. So very different perspectives on that whole thing. And I think we came up with this, up against this whole thing again when Extinction Rebellion came about. And I think the sort of messaging that we've been taking got challenged again. And I think I'm probably boring everyone by talking about evidence, but I think it is about going back again to being led by what people want and taking the time to do some of that scoping and understanding and listening, which is often quite missed out when creating campaigns and thinking through what those next steps are going to be. And you think you've done one piece of audience segmentation and insights work, and then you put it in a cupboard, you base your campaign around it, and that's that for the next kind of 5 years, and no one challenges it until they're forced to again. But I think it is about kind of just properly breaking down. I don't know if somebody's asked about how to reach outside the echo chamber as well. And the European Climate Foundation have just put a fair amount of time and money into a big piece of audience segmentation work that will be ready at some point this year, where they've categorized the whole of the UK into 7 segments based on values. So those values won't necessarily change that much, those categories. But then climate outreach will be doing quite a lot of work on updating continuously how people like to be talked to about justice, climate, air quality and things like that periodically over the years to make sure that we're up to date. And that's a resource that anyone and everyone can use. So yeah, I think the first question is, who are you actually talking to and what motivates them? And then from there, you can speak to a lot more whether you should be talking about the doom and gloom. And that's, for some people, is the big driver. Like, you know, for Hannah, like the courage that you have and that a lot of campaigners and people that work in the climate space have, you get motivated by some of the stuff, or, you know, sometimes I do, some of the stuff that you see going on globally, you feel like you can't bear it. And that's why you carry on doing what you do. But for others, they need to feel that through a slight action they can do something, or it might benefit them by saving them money on their energy bills and things like that. So yeah, it's completely dependent on the person, I would say. And yeah, I just encourage anyone and everyone to just keep asking the questions and keep checking in on how you're communicating and making sure that it's backed by the evidence and the research that, you know, different segments understand and whatnot.
Thanks. On this issue of what people can do, I suppose it brings us on nicely to the most highly voted question we've got in the box, from Joanna, it's quite a long one, so I'll slightly paraphrase, but she's asking, given that it's hard to have a choice to work with sustainable companies when jobs are scarce, with the current crisis, all of this became even harder, and it frustrates me that so many people, me included, are constantly being pushed towards non-sustainable sectors, for example, retail and sales, where we will continue to be part of the problem regardless of our efforts to live a sustainable life outside work. What are your thoughts on this, sustainable jobs? I'll put that to you, Lindsay.
Yeah, well, I guess from the ECIU perspective, we're doing a lot of work on, again, pulling together the evidence of what clean jobs actually means, where they are in the country, what they look like, again, what industries are crumbling before our eyes based on the trends with fossil fuels and things like that that are sort of naturally occurring, and how do you reskill those people to go into other sectors and make sure that skills aren't lost and that jobs are kind of coming back in the hearts of communities that you can be proud of and are future-proofed and long-lasting and all the rest of it. But I guess there's not a lot we can do on that until that sort of change happens at business level or government level. That means that kind of everybody naturally is starting to go that way, which I suppose from an insights perspective, with the number of people and kind of businesses and local authorities and all that have that kind of ambition, it's a really good kind of starting point for that kind of thing. In terms of from a kind of personal perspective, it's really hard to give people advice, I think, on how to get jobs in sustainability, because from my perspective particularly, it was pure luck. I honestly do believe that. And I think like a lot of it is just being in the right place at the right time, if it's not too horrible to say. But you do, unfortunately, and this is part of the kind of speaking from a personal perspective, part of the problem with the sector sometimes is that you have to be able to take unpaid internships or, you know, do that kind of thing to be able to scramble your way into working in charity and things like that. So I think it's some charities do have really good opportunities to work on sustainability matters and paid and things like that, and it's just hunting those out. And if anyone ever is interested in kind of what I did or how I got into my job, as I'm sure any of the other speakers would be happy to share, then I'm more than happy to share my details to kind of talk to that. But yeah, I think on the sort of bigger level, it's just about like what kind of recovery we get now and how we start to transition towards this net zero economy, and hopefully more kind of opportunities will pop up along the way.
Hannah, yeah, thanks a lot for that, Lindsay. Hannah and Paul, could I bring you in on this idea of sustainable jobs, and particularly this idea of jobs around the country, I suppose, not just in London, well-paid jobs in places where there might not be a huge amount of sustainable jobs outside of warehouse or retail work at the moment. How important is that aspect of climate work, and how much should we be focusing on that? Paul, do you want to quickly go first? Sorry, I think you're on mute, Paul. Sorry.
People not only need employment to pay bills, but they need employment that makes sense to them, that what they're doing somehow gives their lives meaning during the hours of work. So one example is to find what your passion is and maybe do a 2-day short course in it to get a feel of doing it. Look for real life examples where that sort of thing has begun to materialize in towns, cities around the country. Like at CAT, we've got a project called Pathways to Farming that allows people to move in to vegetable production and growing, or we've got training courses for people who want to become qualified as a retrofitter. There's a huge amount of buildings we need to retrofit. There's huge amounts of land use and energy systems to install. So if you can find an example where people have come together and done something that really motivates your heart, you can replicate it in your own area. You can contact them, say, how did you set this up, this community energy project, or this local supply chain for vegetables or timber materials or planting, rewilding or whatever, and begin to move it from where it exists, where it's sort of shovel ready and ready to be replicated, into your own backyard. And you'll find that there's some other people around you who are also very keen to get things going. So we can have that real community innovation.
Yeah, I would quickly say, Matt, I mean, this is the entire thing of the Green New Deal. So like, this is like literally what it's all about, is like providing good, solid green jobs in a way that tackles inequality at the same time. So like, that's what we need to be campaigning for. And I think my belief is that that won't happen through like letting the private sector crack on. It hasn't happened so far. Like, we need proper government policies and an industrial strategy that reflects that shift to low carbon work. And we also need to value low carbon work that exists that's currently undervalued. Care work, teaching, you know, those are all actually low carbon professions. We don't think of them, we think about renewable energy projects, but like there's a load of work that needs to be done for us to live like fulfilled, nourished lives that is currently like underpaid, undervalued, often done by migrant workers, and they're even more underpaid and undervalued. And I think that like actually coronavirus is another moment to be like, wait, these are like important jobs. It's like, yeah, they are, and they're low carbon, and they're really vital, and we should pay them properly and like invest in them, and invest in people having good contracts, and you know, them being unionized and all that stuff. So I think it's about reimagining work and investing properly, but we're not going to get it without pushing for it, without a fight, basically. So that's what we need to do.
Brilliant. I think that's a great note to end the Q&A. I'm sorry we haven't been able to get through all the questions that people have submitted, but hopefully we've managed to cover the broad swathe of what most people are trying to get at. So yeah, thank you all for submitting, and thanks all for answering. And with that, I'll pass back to Helena.
Thanks very much, Matt. And thank you all of you panelists as well for your fantastic answers and the discussion. And also to all of you at home for joining us today and for bringing such great questions with you. I've thoroughly enjoyed this hour, and I hope you have too, and learned lots of things to be thinking about. So tomorrow is the final webinar in our mini-series this week, and we'll be discussing how we engage with and have compassionate conversations with our elected representatives and policymakers in these times of crisis. We'll be starting at 2 p.m. again, and the conversation is going to be with three more fantastic speakers. We have Dr. Rebecca Willis from Lancaster University. We have Ruth Edwards, MP for Rushcliffe, and we also have the Acting Director of Hope for the Future, Sarah Robinson, joining us. So it'd be great to have you with us again tomorrow if you're able to join us. Please do take a minute as well now when the webinar ends to fill in the feedback form if you have a minute to do that. It really helps us improve our events in the future. So yeah, we'd really appreciate it if you could do that. But yeah, I don't think there's anything more for me to say. So we hope to see you again tomorrow, and take care, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone.